Mr. Edward John, City of Hamilton, inclusionary zoning. Yes?
Thank you for that very warm welcome. It's been a while. It's exciting to be back in front of the Horseshoe, so thank you. I will do my best for the billing. Just for those who don't know me, I'm Edward John, planner here at City of Hamilton. I have over 15 years experience in development planning, 10 of those in this great city of ours here in Hamilton. Before Hamilton, I did plan in UK and Australia, and with some particular relevance to this discussion topic, I've actually some first-hand experience in implementing and applying inclusionary zoning as it comes through the development approvals process. My presentation is somewhat more informal, so feel free to jump in at any point if you have questions or in need of clarification. Once again, this is a high-level overview. There's been a lot of focus on inclusionary zoning, a lot of discussion. I think part of this presentation is to kind of keep that discussion going. I mean, there's not going to be all the answers today, particularly for the Hamilton context, but hopefully we'll give some added information to those discussions as they go forward. So let's begin at the beginning. What is inclusionary zoning? So one of the most often cited definitions appears here on the screen. It refers to a zoning regulation that requires developers of projects of a certain size to produce a set amount of affordable housing as a condition of development approval. Quite simply, it allows the city to mandate a set number of units on the basis of a development approval. I think it's also important today, given the discussion that we have had on bonusing, is to kind of set out some parameters why inclusionary zoning is different to bonusing. I mean, some of the questions we've heard from council, and certainly some of the answers we've heard, is that bonusing negotiations are not necessarily clear and transparent and are based on a site-by-site basis, and therefore the outcome is not necessarily certain. There's also a large array of community benefit options that are available to the developer as they go through a bonusing negotiation. And as you can imagine, affordable housing, typically because of the complexity in providing it, is at the very bottom of that list for obvious reasons. And once again, we had this through the discussions, but through bonusing, you are limited to the extent of the bonus. So when you consider something as significant as affordable housing, the amount that you can actually precipitate through calculating the bonus is not necessarily providing affordable housing in significant numbers. Certainly from the experience with inclusionary zoning, it certainly has had its criticism, but has provided more consistently affordable housing through the development process. Just a quick recap on why have inclusionary zoning. I think it's important to really understand the why as we go into the next phase of potentially the how. As we're all aware, the housing wait list currently, I think they're sitting just over 5,700 households. That list is going in one direction, and unfortunately it is up with increasing real estate values, buoyant, particularly in this community. Gentrification. So in the UK and Australia and US, inclusionary zoning has been used to quite good effect to deal with the negative consequences of gentrification. I may digress quickly. I do see Renee Wetzler from the Social Planning Council here in the crowd, and I did mention to her on Housing Day how in Hamilton, how wonderful it would be to actually have gentrification as a positive term, and that we can actually deal with those negative consequences which have so unfortunately dealt with the term itself. This social justice, so obviously the increase of affordable housing units, but also this aspect of removing NIMBYism, because through the inclusionary zoning process, the geographical location of those units is not discretionary. Smart growth. Inclusionary zoning does put an emphasis on density and increasing the density of communities, which would obviously complement this prospect of smart growth. There's also a lot of discussion on integration. So mixed-use buildings, reducing the stigma, overcoming generational poverty, which is often cited as one of the main benefits of an inclusionary zoning proposal. Similar with economic diversity, the ability to take the market out of the equation obviously reduces any potential for concentrations of affordable housing because they're spread out as and are consistent with the growth of the community. The reduced funding, as we're all aware, the municipalities have had downloaded the housing for several decades now and are struggling certainly to keep up with the rising demand and the issues we're having with our existing stock. Inclusionary zoning has been discussed as an ability to leverage high growth markets. I will caveat that statement because through any inclusionary zoning process, there's always give and take. There's an element of planning gain that is provided to the developer of a project in exchange for that added density and for the affordable housing units. And then finally, innovation. I think it would be remiss not to mention obviously, the slides that you'll see today are all affordable housing projects which really demonstrate and reduce the stigma of what affordable housing looks like and can look like when all collaboration is made. I think it's important at this point also to just really highlight and manage expectations on inclusionary zoning. I mean, this is a very important list in which to address, but to place this on the back of inclusionary zoning would be inappropriate and unsuccessful. Inclusionary zoning is not a panacea to the housing shortlist waitlists or the housing concerns that we have citywide. Really, it's best used as a complementary tool to the vast array of tools that we're already employing in order to tackle this community-wide issue. I'd also mention that often a limitation cited for inclusionary zoning is this aspect that in most successful programs, it's really dealing with the top end of affordability, the moderate incomes. Very rarely do inclusionary zoning programs delve deep into social housing. And just by means of the complexities inherent in the process, in the absence of additional subsidy, it's very difficult to address that portion of the economic environment. So when will it be implemented? We're all aware of the ministry in their update to the Ontario's long-term housing strategy that inclusionary zoning was mentioned, and it's created a great deal of excitement. It should be noted at this point we are not able to implement inclusionary zoning until the legislative requirements have been put forward by the ministry. Those requirements would give municipalities the ability to obviously not only legislate the amount of affordable units, but ensure that they are affordable in the long term. The ministry have mentioned, though, and have been quite clear that this will be an enabling framework. And what that means is that given the vast array of municipalities in the Greater Golden Horseshoe, municipalities will be able to elect whether they adopt or not inclusionary zoning. If adopted, obviously, there will be recognition that official plan policies and zoning bylaws may have to change just to obviously identify and provide clarity as to how the program will be implemented. And this brings us on to how will it be implemented. The ministry have made it quite clear that all the rules and strategies involved in creating an inclusionary zoning framework have to be clear, transparent, and consistent. Through the bonusing discussion we heard today and through much of the literature, one of the concerns with bonusing is that lack of transparency, the fact it's subject to individual site negotiation. If inclusionary zoning is implemented, the benefits will have to be clear and upfront and mandated to that effect. There's also, before I move on, the idea of financial reasonableness. This is quite implicit in the process, and it speaks to the planning gain that inclusionary zoning must create. It simply cannot be implemented as a tax. It is a tool, not a tax. The fear of implementing this as a tax is obviously that it will stagnate the growth that municipalities have received in housing, and the fear that all those additional costs will be borne quite possibly by the market, and fortunately by ironically creating less affordability at the top end of units. So moving on to how the program should be structured. Quite clearly we need to define affordable housing. There's a number of definitions, but inclusionary zoning will need its own specific reason to address which component of that spectrum it will deal with. Similarly, it will have to target certain income groups. There is a possibility that it could keep that target income group quite wide, but the wider that group, the more difficult and cumbersome it is to implement the program. One of the main talking points, particularly for Hamilton, will be the threshold. At what point is inclusionary zoning triggered? I know back in the UK, it was anything over 10 units was 10% affordable housing. Obviously, that threshold has to really reflect the housing market and how robust that housing market is to accommodate the threshold. You were going to see vast differences to how Toronto implement the threshold and the units set aside compared to Hamilton. There's also this aspect of control periods. This will probably be determined by the ministry, but we will then need to ensure effectively that those units maintain affordability for the long term. We will also have to decide the unit type, rental or ownership. Once again, many of the programs that are available today focus on affordable home ownership, once again to reduce some of the complexities inherent in the framework. That being said, affordable rental certainly can be an option. There are just additional monitoring and review exercises that would need to be done in order to ensure that is facilitated correctly. And then finally, the cost offsets or incentives. This is where it becomes somewhat confusing with the process of bonusing because it sounds a lot like bonusing. Remember that if it is inclusionary zoning, it is mandated, so they may be forced with this prospect of having, let's keep the example, anything over 10 units is 10%. What you would do through the cost offsets was try to ensure that any pro forma working on a particular site makes financial sense. Nothing will occur without financial sense reigning forward. Some of those examples which the ministry have provided include density, increasing the density, reducing certain bylaw standards as parking, and streamlining the approvals process. So that takes us to specific considerations for Hamilton. So the economic impacts on local housing markets. Similar to rent control, critics often raise concern that this will actually stagnate the market, stagnate growth, and place additional burdens in terms of cost onto the market purchases. So therefore, there needs to be robust studies reviewing exactly the nature of the housing market and the needs of that housing market. With regards to economic feasibility, successful programs, I mean, this is consistent with my research and my own experience, really are hinged on collaboration with the development industry. I mean, that's a key component of making this function, is making sure that there is that justification from an economic standpoint. Their thresholds need to be responsible and reasonable and implementable. Another consideration for Hamilton is this aspect of competition with similar municipalities. As I mentioned earlier, the province are looking at this to be an enabling framework, so the chances are there are going to be some municipalities who may not elect to adopt inclusionary zoning, may not elect it in the short term, maybe have longer term visions. So, what position will that place Hamilton in with respect to neighbouring municipalities which may have similar development opportunities? I think, as a high-level response to that, it really emphasizes the importance of a planning gain for the developer so that he can really make a financial argument as to why it makes sense in Hamilton. Another important consideration is Hamilton's varied geography. It's very different to the Torontos of this world, which predominantly will be dealing with multiple dwelling developments. Hamilton has a rural, suburban, and urban area. One program that fits all is hugely unlikely. Hamilton will then have to decide whether they only implement inclusionary zoning for certain areas, or maybe even have different frameworks for different portions of the city. And then finally, the intended approach. There's been a lot of discussion as to what inclusionary zoning shall create. I think when you look at the term inclusionary is that there's a level of integration, but there's an argument to really look at whether the city would be interested in sheer unit numbers, what's the best bang for the buck, or whether you're looking at economic integration, which is a component of really ensuring that each building at a certain threshold incorporates those affordable units. So in terms of next steps, there's a lot of work to be done. I think even with the ministry saying that they're going to do some extensive consultation, we here at the city should certainly be looking and doing some policy analysis. Much of the policy analysis was actually back at the early 2000s when inclusionary zoning in North America and particularly Canada started to becoming a very discussed topic. And certainly in the upcoming months, there's going to be far more analysis that takes place, and we should obviously familiarize ourselves with that. We should be looking and determining local conditions and affordable housing needs. This program, if it is to be implemented, needs, in my opinion, to be tailored. The more tailored it is, the more chance of success, and the more financially reasonable it can become. There's an aspect of monitoring and administration that will come inherent with this process. Making sure that those ultimately who receive the units are those who most likely need it and continue to need it. So there's a monitoring aspect as well as a monitoring aspect of the unit itself as it changes either occupation or ownership. And once again, we should certainly emphasize the fact that this is part of a larger comprehensive housing strategy. In and by itself, it certainly will fail to succeed in all the discussions that I've had to date in terms of its intended role. And then as I come to my final thought, feel free to criticize this because this is me and me alone. But personally, I think when it comes to inclusionary zoning, it shall refer not only to the end user, but the entire process. If it's to be successful, it should be one that draws upon the innovation and collaboration of the industry as a whole through extensive consultation, through robust understanding of local housing markets, and certainly through an investigative process that we take forward. Thank you. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, John. Edward, John, I do have a list, so I hope you're comfortable.
Absolutely.
Councillor Farr.
Yep. Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you, thank you, Ed, for the work you've done so far, and likely much more to come, and specifically to your inclusionary zoning and your personal history in that area. I was intrigued to hear. I didn't realize that in London it's 10% after 10 units, which is probably, I would guess, through you, one of the greatest examples of inclusionary zoning in the world.
Through the chair to the councillor. In fact, I checked back recently, it's now 50% of anything over 10 units. Understanding that the development and the markets are very much different, but certainly it's progressive. But I should caveat too that, London, particularly North London, still has a housing crisis. So, once again, the extent to which inclusionary zoning can solve those problems needs to be managed in terms of expectations.
And to that, and another thing that harkened in my mind was that London is probably one of the greatest cities, if not the greatest city, in terms of just real estate values. Is that a fact?
Through the chair to the councillor, I don't have any definitive empirical information, but anecdotally, yes, that's my opinion.
So, Madam Chair, when you say, quote, very rarely a development will get deep into the social housing side when it comes to inclusionary zoning, is that part of the matrix then? Is that the reason why you would suggest that here?
Edward?
Through the chair, if I understand the question correctly, most programs that are in place often do not deal with social housing, so the subsidy level of housing. They deal with a matrix which looks at home ownership or rental that is affordable, but typically 30%, similar to the PPS and our current Urban Hamilton official plan thresholds, but it deals with that top end of affordability. It doesn't go down without the addition of additional subsidy to the social housing component.
Councillor?
Sorry, as it relates through you, Chair, to Ed, as it relates to places in the world where real estate is at a major peak, like London, England, we're talking about London, England, that is also the case then?
Through the chair to the councillor, yes, I'm speaking now 10 years in the past, things may have changed, but the implementation of inclusionary zoning was actually looking very much at that top-end element. There was still a very strong focus on service providers and other means in which to deal with social housing.
Councillor?
Okay, so you were talking about looking at it in terms of the geographical areas, and through you, Chair, certainly here, and I say quite often that quite proud to be the councillor in Ward 2, where there's no argument. We have been the most inclusive. We have the most social housing. We have the most units, and we continue to work at this gentrification issue in different ways. It's a big conversation now, but also when we have our community conversations on West Harbour, we make a pledge to the public that there'll be a net gain of affordable housing in the setting sail secondary plan area, for example, just one of the latest announcements here in Ward 2. But looking at it as a whole, and then kind of contemplating things like being a second-term city housing board member, and understanding that a lot of the times the folks that are applying, that are on this increasing wait list, and I'm glad you mentioned that, are not applying to live in Ward 2, they're applying to live elsewhere, other parts of the city of Hamilton. So, in parts where perhaps the zoning is more comparable to, a low-rise residential or suburban development. I'm trying to put the two together in how, if it's effective, in your view, it's on the spectrum of the affordable housing scale of affordable home ownership, maybe granny flats, those sorts of things, living in place, aging in place. How do you accommodate the need in areas where you can't really build up, through you, Chair?
Through the chair to the councillor. So I'll unpack that question in two parts. Hopefully I will address both. In terms of the applicability of inclusionary zoning to the suburbs, certainly the US have many examples where single-family detached dwellings have been included in inclusionary zoning programs. So it's not necessarily narrowly defined as only dealing with your urban areas with your multiple dwellings. There's a great deal more questions when you start having two different approaches, which I mentioned in my presentation. And then the second part of that is that, certainly there's going to have to be an understanding of local housing markets when you deal with inclusionary zoning citywide. There's a suggestion, too, that certain suburban areas or rural areas, for that matter, may not be that best accommodated for certain elements when it comes to transit, when it comes to schools and other matters which may be a pressing need in the affordable housing spectrum. So that too would have to feed into how you design that program. I'm not sure if I caught your question, but perfect, thank you.
Primarily, Madam Chair, is I wanted to hear that it's not just urban areas. It's when we're talking about inclusionary zoning, we're not just talking about added density to larger developments, medium or higher density developments. It can be in a rural, or maybe not rural, but an urban expansion area or a suburban neighborhood.
Through the chair to the councillor, certainly they would have a different approach, but that's a possibility. And certainly the reverse to that, and only having it in the urban areas, there is a concern there that what you're actually doing indirectly is encouraging greater suburban sprawl, because for want of a better term, you may have inclusionary zoning in your downtown, so many developers are looking elsewhere where they don't have to be a part of that inclusionary zoning. So inadvertently you may be creating some suburban sprawl. So there is an argument to make sure that it's in some way consistent, understanding the very different and separate housing markets that exist across the city.
Well, that just speaks to, through your tailored comment. You could still have it, but it'd be tailored differently in a suburban area as opposed to a downtown, but ultimately trying to achieve that goal. And again, the focus is, through you, Chair, on less on social housing when we're talking about inclusionary zoning, more on that part of, or the piece of the affordable housing spectrum, which is a broad spectrum on the side that sees affordable home ownership or RGIs even, and those sorts of things. So that can happen anywhere. And if it needs to be tailored differently, that's fine. But it's an interesting concept. I know you have much more work to do. And just to quickly comment, I'm certain that around this table we've heard, the Waterdown councillor not long ago, Councillor Partridge, talking about her needs in her community, and there's a long way to go to achieve those needs. And certainly we want to do whatever we can as a planning body, as a committee, and ultimately as a council to address needs in places like Waterdown. And I hear you, transit's an issue, and we got to work on that separately, and other issues. But if there's a desire and there's a part of that affordability spectrum, there's people out there that have that desire, then we have to do whatever we can to make that work in those places and consider it maybe tailored, but a citywide issue. Excellent, thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Collins.
Thanks, and it's been very enjoyable working with Ed on the housing file, and as is evident with his presentation, he's very knowledgeable when it comes to these policies, how they've worked and haven't worked in other areas of the world. So Ed, appreciate all of your assistance with that. I do have a question related to Councillor Farr's, and that is the whole issue related to the RGI versus affordable home ownership. And when I followed social media and the media stories, when the province announced that they were giving serious consideration to policy changes and allowing municipalities to look at implementing inclusionary zoning, there was all kinds of celebration that this means thousands of extra units for Hamilton in particular over the next number of years, because it means 15, 10%, 5% of all new home builds or residential unit builds will be affordable, which, as Councillor Farr has pointed out, there's a pretty big spectrum there in terms of what is affordable, from home ownership to rent geared to income unit. Your experience in other places, is that too ambitious to think that we're looking at thousands of units for affordable housing as part of whatever policy changes come from the province and may subsequently then be approved by the city?
Through the chair to the councillor, thousands of units, I think certainly that's ambitious. I speak to the importance of really understanding the appropriate and reasonable threshold for Hamilton in particular, in which, if it ever was applied, inclusionary zoning was applied. We have Jennifer Keesmatt in Toronto talking about developments over 200 units. As we go through the amount of units and developments that we've had here in the city, and I've dealt with a few of the very high density ones, I think only one in my knowledge has actually exceeded that value. And understanding that when you deal with a unit count above 200, it's very easy to get more towards that financial reasonableness because you're spreading the value across a greater number of units. I'm excited about inclusionary zoning. I think it plays a very important part. I think some of the most important parts it plays is just keeping the negotiation and discussion of affordable housing in the front of everyone's minds. The actual implemented social housing units that are created through this process, the empirical evidence, although it's varied, would say that that's difficult. There is a concept of what's called urban filtering, so you focus on the top end of affordability and hopefully that frees up some of the units below. That has too come under great criticism. But once again, I think as Hamilton goes through this process of reviewing whether this will work, if not now, maybe in the future, we'll get to that point of determining what means success for Hamilton.
Thank you, Councillor.
Thanks for that. And I'm surprised that the province hasn't established or hasn't created a policy that applies across the province. And you raised some points in your presentation that speak to the whole issue of competitiveness. Those municipalities that choose not to adopt an inclusionary zoning policy might stand a better chance of encouraging new investment in their communities because there's a lower cost for the developer. Those that maybe deem it as important in terms of addressing our social housing needs or even affordable home ownership to an extent may be at a disadvantage because we are now forcing something upon the development community they may not want to build. So it makes sense to do this across the province, so we're all working on a level playing field, but it seems as though they'll allow municipalities to pick and choose what programs they have and how they'll be implemented. How do we wrestle with that on a go-forward basis, knowing that we may have others around us who choose not to adopt it, and I think I know where Hamilton Council and our community wants to go. But if others don't do the same, how does that help or hurt us?
Edward?
Through the chair to the councillor, I mean, first and foremost, I would give recognition to the wonderful work City of Hamilton staff and the community have done in placing Hamilton in a position that truly is the place to invest right now. I think we need to continue that focus. I think in terms of that aspect of being at a competitive disadvantage to potentially other municipalities that do not have inclusionary zoning, I think the focus is to really deal with the idea of planning gain. So through the inclusionary zoning framework, really provide meaningful incentives to which could actually entice the developers to stay and participate in that program. It is interesting. I mean, Hamilton is in a difficult place, as we've mentioned today, because we do incentivize a lot as it stands. And, you know, when we look at some of the, I'll just move to it now, cost offsets, I mean, density, parking reductions, streamlined approvals process. I mean, the Connolly went through, I think, in 127 days, the Tivoli, 118 days. I mean, we're making great efforts to provide this to bring developers to Hamilton today. So is it going to be complicated to really provide some meaningful incentives? Absolutely. But, you know, Hamilton's always up for a challenge.
Great. I appreciate all your hard work again, Edward, and planning staff in general. I know the whole department, as well as our housing staff, have been very proactive related to this file and others, so thank you for that.
Thank you. Councillor Skelly.
Thank you. Through the chair, could you explain to me, I understand how market rental units would work, but how does it, how would it apply to purchasing a home?
Through the chair to the councillor, that will actually need to be determined through the process. Certainly my experience in London, UK, when it came to the affordable home ownership, there was a separate housing providing service that maintained the unit over time. So, for instance, of a condo, some of the big arguments is a condo developer builds the building, he's gone, and only the tenants or the owners are left. In this situation, you would actually be handing over those units at a reduced value to a housing provider who would then maintain a program to ensure all the end users meet the affordable threshold. So they would have to provide means testing in terms of their income in order to qualify for those units. They wouldn't be able to sell those units. You would only be able to give back those units to the housing provider, who then, on the next owner, or wouldn't be an owner, potentially long-term renter, would then come in.
Thank you. Through the chair, you're not then suggesting that inclusionary zoning and market ownership would apply in a new subdivision with a home that is a single-family unit?
Through the chair to the councillor, so the US does have examples where it's been applied to single-family dwellings in suburban environments. Once again, it's complicated because of that service management requirement to ensure through legal agreements that that unit stays affordable in the long term. So typically what is done is that a legal agreement is registered, such as a covenant on title, that will, at any point in terms in the future when they come to sell it, it would have to be sold as an affordable unit.
Councillor?
Okay, that makes more sense. Thank you. As the councillor representing Ward 7, which has actually the second highest number of housing units in the city, one of my observations, and I think they're great neighborhoods, we have a number of affordable housing complexes near Ronald Road and Stonechurch, but one of the big issues is walkability and isolation because of the limited transit. And that community, that ability to get out and walk in your neighborhood. So I would suggest that it's wonderful, but we also have to recognize that that everyone, including people who are looking to have access to affordable housing, also need access to transit. And I think that it's a very obvious problem in that particular part of my work. That's all. Thank you.
Councillor Aidan Johnson.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thanks, Ed, for the presentation. I've been super impressed by all the fabulous work you've been doing on the waterfront, and I'm wondering if you could comment on how inclusionary zoning might relate to the waterfront and the possibilities for social housing there.
Through the chair to the councillor, as I mentioned in my presentation, formally inclusionary zoning is not currently an option today. We don't have the legislative ability to ensure the affordability of the unit over time. What we do have with the waterfront is ownership of the land. So if the desire from council was to include any element of affordable housing on the waterfront, similar to the issues I raised in this presentation, there's going to have to be given some thought as to how, first of all, what percentage of units would go affordable, what section of the spectrum would you gear the units towards, and then finally, how would you secure in the long term that they remain affordable? So for the waterfront, the only slightly rosier picture is that we are the owner of the land, and therefore the ability to regulate some of these requirements is somewhat easier, but there's still a lot of thought that would have to be given to exactly how that program is implemented.
When you say we need to give it thought, what are the relevant concerns that you're referring to or thinking of?
Through the chair to the councillor, once a threshold has been determined, so let's take 5-10% of those units that are to be affordable, the key is to maintaining the fact that they remain affordable. So we'd have to have some legal input to make sure that we can continue that those units forever and a day stay affordable in order to really meet that purpose.
And is that not a question through you, Madam Chair, of contracting and proper contract language?
Through the chair to the councillor, I would seek some legal input. I know that, part of the reason why we're waiting for the ministry to make legislative changes is so that we can actually register covenants that speak to this aspect. I'm not sure how clear it is in the current legal system that we can maintain without challenge those types of covenants on title. And then the other element too is the monitoring. So making sure that we have set up the administration and monitoring of those units, once again, to ensure the long-term affordability.
Madam Chair, would you mind if I directed that question through to Joanna?
Absolutely. Joanna?
Any comments?
Thank you, Madam Chair. To my knowledge, I agree with Mr. John. The challenge is what tools do we have in place to ensure that subsequent owners of the property are bound by those, how that's set up. So I'd be interested to see if changes are made in the future to give us better tools to do that.
And do you have any concern, through you, Madam Chair, a present inability to create contract language that would create the necessary obligation on the part of the landlord/developer? Is it the case that we need some kind of new contractual ability that we don't currently enjoy, and that has to be part of the new laws?
Those types of agreements are typically handled by the real estate lawyers in my department. I will say, though, that those types of requirements that would be registered on title either does need to be explicit provisions in order for us to enforce that for subsequent owners. I'm not aware of any tools that we have at the moment that would allow us to do that.
Councillor?
That's really neat. Neat yet obviously a concern. I'm wondering if, without a motion, simply orally, if I could request that our real estate legal team provide some kind of comment specifically on that question. What do we need that we don't currently have? What are concerns we should be aware of? Is that?
Do we have real estate here, or would you prefer Joanna to?
My understanding from Joanna's answer, which I take as completely appropriate and responsible, is that she's not a real estate specialist, and
I don't
probably
believe
need to go to a
have
specialist.
one. And I don't believe we have a real estate
I meant at a
specialist
future
here.
date. It could even email to me or email to all of council, whatever. But to me, that to me is an important question that we need to think about. So I would make the request.
If at your indulgence, Mr. Thorne would like to respond.
Yes, through the chair, I'm responding because the real estate disposition process for the West Harbour lands, which is sort of the specific example where the councillor's question was related to, is being actually worked on within my department, and that is a question that we're working through with real estate. Is in anticipation, if council wants to require an affordable housing component in the West Harbour lands, what would be the legal mechanism for requiring that from any developer and for maintaining that over time? So we can certainly. I don't have a final answer yet on what that mechanism might be if council wants to take that path, but can certainly maybe try to fast track at least the question of what the tool looks like to respond to the councillor's question.
Thank you, Councillor.
That would be great. I mean, good to know that we're on that. That's great. Good. I have a question about tailoring, which is a kind of a lovely word you've brought into our conversation. So I'll cut to my local Ward 1 example. So we heard from Councillor Skelly a good question about, does inclusionary zoning apply to suburbs? And basically I took from your answer that in terms of new suburban housing, we could tailor our inclusionary zoning rules in various ways, from exemption for housing developments in suburbs through to non-exemption. Is that so? Before I go on to my Ward 1 based question, is that an accurate summation of what I heard?
Edward?
Through the chair to the councillor, so I'll caveat all that I say that we really haven't had much information from the ministry in terms of how they would really have us set up the framework for inclusionary zoning. Drawing upon some of the other examples that exist today, I don't think you would use the threshold and the units set aside the same in an urban area as you would a suburban area. Typically, the ability to spread the cost in a high-density multiple dwelling is different to what you can do potentially in a subdivision, depending on the size. But really what it needs is just for someone to really test the markets and understand, are they different markets? What's the most appropriate ways in which to secure inclusionary zoning, understanding the different challenges from an environmental perspective?
Councillor?
Got it. So is it the case that we're anticipating guidelines, suggestions, or binding rules from the ministry? Or is it the case that we've been given as broad a discretion as it sounds like to craft our own rules within the silo of inclusionary zoning?
Through the chair to the councillor, so much of the information on this slide you have before you is pretty much the extent of the information that we've really received from the ministry. At this point, it's been very high-level discussion. I've attended one of their presentations, and I asked a number of questions, and it was clear from the answers that they're still waiting for the consultation to take place before they finalize exactly the information they're going to disseminate to the ministry, to the municipalities. So to that extent, we may have the ability as a municipality to look at all these different program elements and make a decision. And if we're in that position, then it's a very complicated and challenging process that will require a lot of review.
Councillor?
Got it. So we don't know yet is the answer, but right now we're working on possibilities so as to be ready for when we know. Is that accurate?
Edward?
Through the chair to the councillor, certainly I think all the municipalities are now looking towards the implications of inclusionary zoning and particularly how it fits to their own communities.
Got it. So to go to my Ward 1 question, I'm wondering how inclusionary zoning might apply when it comes to new developments targeted specifically at students. Would it be appropriate to suggest that maybe that's an instance where we require what you've been calling tailoring? Question mark. Any comments on student housing in general, these inclusionary?
Edward?
Through the chair to the councillor, through the zoning process, we're actually unable to determine the demographics. So, speak to students versus other elements of the demographic spectrum. Certainly we're looking at land uses. The interesting thing about inclusionary zoning is it does bring into this discussion of affordable housing, which is a segment of that demographic input. But at this point, from a human rights position, it would be very difficult to isolate students and tailor a program just for students under the Planning Act.
Thank you, Councillor.
Okay, very good. And I'll look forward to sort of talking about that question going forward. In the wake of, just informationally, Madam Chair, in the wake of the recent OMB ruling in the case of 111 Winston, it is the case of the relevant human rights argument that thinking about student housing as a unique category is contrary to human rights has gone away. But it does appear, just conversationally, that there may be some chunks being ripped out of that particular argument. That argument is not as strong today as it was a few weeks ago. But we'll look forward. I understand the complexity there. So I'll look forward just to talking about the Ward 1 student housing question. And not just student housing question, but student apartment building question as it may relate to inclusionary zoning. What one concern in all that being, just to kind of provide a comment as opposed to a question, I wonder if some of those units might not count as housing for lower income tenants anyway, given that many students fall into the category of lower income. But I say that not with a question mark, but just sort of something to chew on and think about. A further question, through you, Madam Chair. Edward, I really appreciated your references to inclusionary zoning as a possible anti-NIMBYist tool and inclusionary zoning as a tool that could help us create positive gentrification. I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that question a bit more. Positive versus negative gentrification, what did you mean exactly?
Edward?
Through the chair to the councillor, I'll come under some criticism, but gentrification in and by itself can be regarded as a positive process. I mean, it is a process by which investment returns to an area that has, for a set period of time, lost that investment. The problem being is that obviously when the market becomes involved, there's this creation of a marginalizing effect for those people who live in that community who can no longer afford the increase in rental values and the increase in property values that occur due to gentrification. So in terms to make gentrification a positive process, the key is to obviously balance those negative impacts. So inclusionary zoning allows you to somewhat take the market out of the equation because you are ensuring that affordability is tagged to the new growth. So, you know, any new development in an area that is currently being gentrified would have that component where it would have to implement affordable units and therefore help mitigate and in some cases prevent the negative consequences of that process.
Councillor?
Thanks very much. I have no further questions. I just wanted to close by saying that I'm reminded in some ways of the discussion we had last summer in the context of AFA re the possibility of asking for land transfer taxation power, in that Councillor Collins' argument to me is a very important and good one. What if we do a very robust, tailored inclusionary zoning rule in Hamilton and adjoining municipalities or municipalities close by Southwest Ontario municipalities of note do not? And are we putting ourselves at a significant disadvantage? So I think that's just something to keep in mind and worry about in an appropriate way. That said, as in the conversation about land transfer taxation, I think it would be short-sighted to not go down the road of inclusionary zoning. Based on everything I'm hearing, it jives well with our LRT project that by all signs is coming. It jives well with our waterfront, notwithstanding and including all the complexities we've heard about in terms of how it might be implemented at the waterfront. It jives in terms of growth in the city and the hot real estate market in the city. And we know that we have a deep need. One of our most pressing urgent crises in Hamilton is our social housing crisis. So I'm very hopeful for inclusionary zoning, and I'm grateful to the staff for helping us guide the way and find the way through all these complexities. I'm hopeful we can find our way to a good place. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor. And I have Councillor Van Der Beek.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Edward. Through you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Edward. Great presentation, as always. I have a couple of questions. I think, first of all, I'd like to clarify something. So this inclusionary zoning is looking like it's going to be more about additional rental housing in the city as opposed to affordable home ownership. Is that correct?
Through the chair to the councillor, no, that's not correct. That's an option that will have to be determined as you go through establishing the programmable elements of inclusionary zoning. Once again, if you look at those inclusionary frameworks that are in place, in fact, most of them focus more on affordable home ownership than they do on rental. But that's not to say that inclusionary zoning cannot obviously look towards the rental market.
So thank you. Through you, Madam Chair. So I think my confusion is around the discussion about another entity who's going to be in charge of the pricing of these units, etc. And so I guess that's where my confusion comes. So if this entity is going to be in charge of how much the units are going to continue to go for in the future, are they just going to be in charge of the person who owns it? Like, I can't quite figure out where that would go. So if you can help me clarify that one, I'd appreciate that.
Edward?
Through the chair to the councillor, once again, these are all decisions to be made. A big element of what the ministry is telling us is the administration of these units. So it may not be a separate entity, which is the service provider that we typically have in how we regulate, a social housing. This could be a component of City Hall, which makes sure that when those units are vacated or sold, that they're sold back to that, I'll call it an entity, but that portion of City Hall that regulates and determines who's next on the list for the affordability. The key is to maintain the affordability of the unit and understanding that the market's changes over time, and therefore that cost will have to be tagged to the growth of the economy.
Councillor?
Thank you. Sounds very complicated to me. It sounds like a lot of, I would call it government interference, but in a good way. But it just seems like another layer of government control that we have to be responsible for. However, I guess we'll see how that comes out when they bring things forward. So if we're gearing to affordability, we have things in place that have come from the government. For instance, the Housing and Affordability Act, I think it was called, in 2011, that said that cities had to put into their zoning bylaw the ability for second units in single-family semis, townhouses, and ancillary buildings like laneway garages. So where are we with that? Like, what's happened with that? Have we instituted that? Can pretty much anybody apply to put a second unit in their home to make home ownership affordable?
Through the chair to the councillor, you're talking to the right person. So currently we do have ability in our zoning bylaw to accommodate in certain areas secondary units. I think at the current point in time, the difficulty we have is if those secondary units are in or within an accessory building. We do have a policy in our Urban Hamilton official plan that says that, for that type of approach, we need to do a study just to ensure we understand fully the impacts. And the reason why I said you're talking to the right person is because it's actually on my work plan to look at exactly that study and to see the components of that study to assist with that complete adoption of the secondary unit approach.
Councillor?
Thank you. I guess what I really want to ask is as we go forward, through you, Madam Chair, sorry, to Edward, as we go forward with whatever comes down from the province, are we actually taking advantage of the tools that we have already and the tools that we may be given to be addressing affordable housing in this city? So recognizing that affordable housing and social housing are not one and the same, and that we have for this council and in this term of office, we have made poverty, affordable housing, and social housing resolutions a priority. And so I guess my question is that as we're doing this and looking at certain aspects of inclusionary zoning, for instance, have we already got on that work plan as part of a bigger picture the opportunities that are there that we have not been fully utilizing, including changes to things like our bylaws, our parking enforcement bylaws, and our parking requirements, off-site parking requirements, and things like that will encourage young and old, so young people who are looking for a first-time home who can't afford to purchase in some areas of the city, an opportunity to subsidize their purchase, their mortgage payment, or people who are now empty nesters and are looking to hang on to their home because now they're retired and their income is different, to keep making home ownership affordable and leaving rental accommodation for people who require rental accommodation.
Through the chair to the council, that's a great question. I mean, I think as part of my process, thematically, I was trying to explore that concept itself, that this is a comprehensive strategy when you're dealing with housing. It's not going to be one policy or one solution that's going to really deal with the rising issue that we have when it comes to affordability for the entire spectrum. And I believe that there is a greater need to obviously integrate as best as possible that all the varying options that you do have. It's a complicated strategy. There are a number of moving parts, number of funding sources, number of programs, and it's very difficult to navigate those waters. Certainly, there's a great array of options available today, and quite frankly, inclusionary zoning may complement or may not be necessary depending on the specific requirements of Hamilton and how they deal with their strategy. So that's still on the table. I'm not at all suggesting that inclusionary zoning is somehow the silver bullet which will come forward and resolve those problems. I think we're doing some great work both within the city and through our community partners on dealing with this rising issue. And as I mentioned before, the biggest thing about inclusionary zoning for me in terms of success is making sure that people really continue to focus on this issue. It may not be inclusionary zoning is the answer, but it's people really struggling and working collaboratively to come up with a solution.
Councillor?
Thank you, and through you, so just one last thing. And so would you say then that in looking at it as a complete strategy, that we may answer the concerns of previous speakers about what happens with the suburbs and inclusionary zoning, and what happens with where the suburbs are full of single-family and semis and townhouses, and perhaps not so much high-rise apartment buildings, where there'd be the opportunity for that sort of fallout to meet the needs in the suburbs of more inclusionary, affordable housing.
Edward?
Through the chair to the councillor, if I understand your question correctly, this certainly is applicability for all areas of the city when it comes to affordability. It's just complicated based on the very varied geography in terms of coming up with a responsive and reasonable framework when it deals with inclusionary zoning. Back to your former point, there are lots of options that we still need to explore and implement when we come to creating a comprehensive strategy. I think there's many people working very hard on doing just that. And once again, this inclusionary zoning can be a tool potentially used or not to continue to address that issue.
Councillor?
Thank you, Edward.
Thank you. Councillor Conley?
Thank you. Very informative. I'm really glad that you came presented to us today, Edward. I'm just trying to get some clarity. Inclusionary zoning is something that the provincial government is working on, trying to get a policy for. And is there a time limit? Is any idea when that's going to come to?
Through the chair to the councillor, certainly inclusionary zoning has been around for a long time in other areas of the world, and I think Ontario have been asking of the province the ability to implement inclusionary zoning. There is a legislative requirement that the ministry must give to municipalities to be allowed to do inclusionary zoning. And in terms of timing, like I said, on speaking with members from the ministry, they're within this period of consultation. They understand the gravity and the complexity of this process, and so they're really at that point just gathering information from the development industry, from social housing providers, and from communities and municipalities. So in the next few months, we're hoping that the picture will come somewhat more into focus. Right now, we've been given very little information to go on.
And do you think when it comes through, is it going to be mandatory that we do inclusionary zoning, or is it going to be optional per each community?
Through the chair to the councillor, that is in fact one of the areas where they have provided guidance, and they have mentioned on a number of times that it will be an enabling framework. So what we've determined is that the municipalities will be able to elect whether they accommodate inclusionary zoning or not. It will be up to the municipalities.
And even if we do it, it's not going to solve any the problem. It's going to assist as one of the pieces that will assist people trying to get affordable housing, etc. Is that fair to say?
Edward?
Through the chair to the council, I think there's a certain need to manage expectations. For a long time, inclusionary zoning has been discussed as a means to significantly address housing waitlists and so forth. And my presentation was hopefully a cautionary tale that while there are some great success stories with inclusionary zoning, there is no silver bullet to the housing crisis that we have.
So
Councillor?
when you talk about inclusionary zoning, Chair, would that include developments like building 300 houses in a survey or something? Would inclusionary zoning be part of that, or is it more for apartment building complexes, etc.? What is the plan? Because when you talk about suburbs, I guess, we don't have high-rise apartments. I don't anyway. Might be getting some shortly, but don't have any right now. 19-story one, but anyways, does it include if I'm building 300 townhouses in a survey? Could that be part of inclusionary zoning? That we could take some of those houses and use them for affordable housing?
Edward, sorry.
Through the chair to the councillor, it could well be. Once again, we are a creature of the province, and we are looking to them to see what type of guidelines they provide us. If they really just give us the ball and say run with it, we will have to make that decision as a municipality how we deal with the different geographies that we have between the rural, suburban, and urban areas, and that may include, whether we extend the program to include all areas or reserve it for certain areas of the city.
So when we make those decisions, it won't be on an ad hoc situation where you might do it at Stony Creek, but not in Ancaster or Dundas or whatever one you want to. It would be for all of Hamilton suburbs. Would that be the idea?
Through the chair, that certainly would be my recommendation. I mean, to indiscriminately choose different sections of the city could be very problematic in terms of the programming of this inclusionary zoning framework, just because similar to the concern with competition between different municipalities, you may have competitions within the city which may not be desirable from a city building perspective.
Councillor?
Thank you very much for your comments.
Thank you. Second time, Councillor Scully.
Thank you, Edward. Do you know if we have more demand for affordable housing or social housing?
Through the chair to the councillor, that's another great question, and part of my presentation was the need to really evaluate where in the spectrum we have the greatest demand, and not necessarily that inclusionary zoning should deal with the greatest demand, but just to understand the context of demand. Certainly, as I mentioned, there's this concept of urban filtering, so if you can somehow target a certain area, is there a possibility for that to benefit indirectly other portions of the spectrum? It's those types of concepts that really need to be investigated for Hamilton, but we need to understand that context, and you're right, exactly where the affordable and affordability issues are.
Thank you. Councillor?
Through the chair, how much more affordable is affordable housing? What is the percentage of a discount?
Just to clarify through the councillor, based on the provincial definition, a dwelling unit that sells for under $300,000 would meet the test of affordable in the city of Hamilton based on the provincial definition. So when we're talking about affordable, that is the price threshold. So that would be whether it's a townhouse, apartment building, a single-family dwelling, back-to-back unit, provided it sells for less than $300,000, it would be considered to be affordable, owner-occupied affordable in the city of Hamilton.
And rent?
The test sort of correlates to 30% of the household income being spent on rent, or whether it be on principal mortgage payment or on rent. So again, it would probably be, I think it's in that $1,200 to $1,500 range. I would just have to confirm with our housing staff, but that would meet the threshold for affordability it's not based on what rental households are actually paying, but it's defined as 30% of the household average household income within the city of Hamilton, and that's how the province sets the definition. So that's why I think it's about that $1,200 to $1,500 a month would be considered to be a maximum affordable rent within the city of Hamilton.
For,
Counselor?
through the chair, for a one-bedroom, two-bedroom, three-bedroom house?
It's based on family household income, so it's irrespective of whether it's they're renting a one-bedroom apartment or if that household needs a three-bedroom apartment. If the unit is being delivered under that sort of price range, it meets the provincial definition of affordable. So for those councillors who remember the 90s, all the townhouse projects that were being approved, they were meeting the test of affordability because they were owner-occupied affordable. And then those units were then, the province was sort of piggybacking on those sort of private sector affordable housing projects, being directly involved in the provision of affordable housing, where the province was working with nonprofit groups or co-ops to deliver affordable housing that would then be means tested against the tenants or the owner residents of those individual units.
Councillor?
Through the chair, how do we determine who is eligible for affordable housing? My concern is that you can't actually refuse anyone because of human rights. Is that true?
Have we got someone here from?
So the part of the issue becomes, through you, Madam Chairman, is the means testing as well, so that as they may meet the initial definition based on their income, so they provide their, they demonstrate their income sources as to what they are, sort of their income salary is, they would then meet that threshold. But once they're in there, if their income increases, there is no ongoing means in some of these units to do that ongoing testing and the means testing to ensure that those units stay affordable. And I think, as Mr. Edward indicated at the early discussions with the province, or Mr. John, we indicated that was an issue raised with the province as to how do you ensure the long-term affordability of these units, whether it's because of the owner or the tenants, their income increases, and or sort of the resale or the re-rental controls if they're within the public realm, to ensure that they provide that long-term affordability, as opposed to when the units are being within either the city or a non-profit groups, which is responsible for ensuring the long-term affordability of those units.
Councillor?
Through the chair, if the city does move forward to include affordable housing at the waterfront, that will be some of the most sought-after real estate and rental units in the city of Hamilton. How can we ensure that people who are applying, and can we actually prevent people who have is there any way of actually determining who can go and access those units for 20, 30% less than the going rate? Again, from my understanding is that you can't prevent anyone from from renting those units. And I'll go back to the example of Olivia Chow and Jack Layton using affordable housing units. How do you prevent anybody in the prime piece of real estate in the city of Hamilton renting that clearly don't fall or aren't in need of social or affordable housing?
Excuse me, I think we're talking about process of affordable housing rather than the planning of affordable housing. So I will go to Joanna to see if she has an answer for that. But I think it's probably best to wait until Joanne Prowl or someone from Community Social Services can actually talk about the process of applications, who's eligible and who's not. So Joanna, I know that you probably you probably didn't catch the entire question. The entire question was based on how do we determine who's available for social housing and who is not. If you're not able to answer that, Kristen. Sorry, Joanna, thank you.
Am I on? There we are. It's quite administratively complex, but we can certainly test incomes of people who are renting those units and test them on an ongoing basis to ensure that they're paying what they can afford rather than something more.
Why don't you reword it, but keep in mind that we need to have the people who are actually doing the process in the room. That might make it beneficial for your answers.
I'll try to reword it. My question is, how do you assure the people who would have access to the units, the number of affordable units is there a limit in terms of their income to prevent or to restrict certain people having access to affordable units?
Through the chair to the councillor, I can maybe come partway into answering that. So as you go through, and this is purely on inclusionary zoning, so I'm speaking on if the city were to implement inclusionary zoning and the program elements, through that framework, they would come up, as the slide shows, and have to determine the target income groups that would be eligible. So they would determine from study and from discussions with the ministry what that threshold of that target income would be that would make them eligible. And then obviously we would have to monitor that to make sure that over time they don't increase in terms of their income and then become uneligible. So there is an ongoing administrative process. To your point on the human rights aspect of whether we can or not do that, I'm of the opinion that the ministry will come in and provide clarification as they make the legislative requirements through the inclusionary zoning process.
Okay, thank you. So just to be clear, let's keep it on the planning perspective because we have planning staff here, just so that you can get the correct answers. Are you finished? Okay, Councillor Farr for the second time.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just on some of the stuff that I've heard, I guess one of the ways we can ensure affordable housing maintains its integrity in terms of who's in those units is if the City Housing Hamilton folks managed it. However, we're not in expansion mode right now. Our president will tell you. We're just trying to keep up with maintaining. And to that end, and specific to the setting sail secondary plan area, it's something you know very well, Edward, and one of the many points with respect to the vision, and which has been alluded to by a previous speaker from Ward 1 and well presented, is that we may include in the vision, we may include 25% affordable housing in the setting sail secondary plan. Through you, Chair. True.
Through the chair to the councillor, there is a policy in the setting sail secondary plan that speaks to just that, yes.
Back to the point through you, Chair, thank you, that I made the first time around, where we began a community conversation about a year ago, monthly community conversations on the West Harbour area, with respect to a commitment to a net gain of affordable housing in the setting sail secondary plan area, and of 100 to 200 units. And one of the things I didn't mention before, but it's certainly well known, is we're including our partnerships with the private sector in making that net gain possible. And certainly quite publicly, I would assume, well, one of the two quite publicly, but the other is well known, it seems, in the North End, private folks are going after that net gain pledge. They're from separate orgs, not affiliated to the city, however, are both steadfastly being very diligent in accomplishing many units. I'd say upwards 50 to 60 units of the 100 to 200 that we're pledging be part of a net gain. They are not, through you, Chair, long-winded preamble, but through you, that work wouldn't, our inclusionary zoning work wouldn't help in those cases where they're actually building nothing but affordable housing.
Edward?
Through the chair to the councillor, they would obviously already meet the requirement, if ever a requirement was placed upon new development, presumably if it's 100% affordable. I mean, I think we certainly could still discuss cost offsets as an option, because that will be part of the package if it is ever introduced, as to what additional planning gain these types of developments can endure, and that may be part of the discussion too.
Thank you,
So
Councillor.
either we've already had this conversation, or you
Okay.
can read my mind, but certainly on the screen and at the bottom bullet, particularly the streamlined approval process, both orgs are in the ward, both are giddy to get going, and both will tell you this is all great. They love it. Inclusionary zoning talk, affordable housing talk, the build up. A lot of the organizations are right here in Ward 2 to begin with, so it's no surprise, and gentrification is definitely a main topic of conversation, and not only in Ward 2, obviously throughout the lower city, throughout the city. So a lot of people are very impressed that we've had a special planning meeting on this subject today, and all of the work that you and Jason and Ed and everybody on staff have done. But they would love for us sooner rather than later to at least take that streamlined approval process bullet out of this great conversation that is relatable and do it soon. So how can we, what can we do to that end to streamline approvals for those who are giddy to get going on creating nothing but affordable housing? And in this case, one is about 40 units of housing with support. So that's when we're talking about the spectrum, that's over here. From affordable home ownership over here, and the other is keeping seniors aging in place. Through you, Chair.
Edward?
Through the chair to the councillor, when it becomes the streamlined approvals process, obviously there are some legislative requirements that must be met. Outside of that, there really just has to be a focus on reviewing the application in short order. I think City of Hamilton has had some success with some notable projects in certainly getting them before Planning Committee and Council within an expedited time frame. So certainly the effort is there and the focus is there, provided we meet those legislative frameworks.
Thank you, Councillor.
So you mentioned the Tivoli and you mentioned the Connolly, and I appreciate that. Through you, Chair. And finally, these ones undoubtedly would, as soon as that expedited approvals process occurred, already they're ready to go and start putting a shovel in the ground, as opposed to your two examples. I'm not knocking it. I was very impressed and remain impressed today that the Tivoli and the Connolly approvals went, within 112 days from concept to approval. But they would like that too. So is this something maybe perhaps offline, and it is somewhat relatable, not completely, but maybe flowing from the inclusionary or affordable housing conversations that we have in a special planning meeting, we can maybe create some streamlined approvals process for those interested in going sooner rather than later on these kinds of projects that are key for not only the downtown but the entire city.
Edward?
Yeah, so through the chair, I think a lot of those questions are starting to get into sort of the realm of what we're looking at through the Open for Business initiative, which is looking at streamlined approvals across the board, looking at applying lean process improvements to approvals specific to affordable housing. I think the creation of Ed's position actually was one aspect of actually putting some dedicated resources, some expertise specifically on the housing file to provide it some extra attention when those projects come through the door. But in terms of and we also have a report coming to the next planning cycle related to planning fees for affordable housing that also responds to some council direction we've had. So we are looking generally at approvals process through Open for Business, and then in terms of fees and providing some targeted resources within the department to support affordable housing, we're looking at those issues as well.
Thank you, Councillor.
And when will we, Jason, have a report back on the feasibility of all what you've just...
The timeline, Mr. Thorne?
So through the chair, on the planning fees for affordable housing is the next committee meeting, which is May the 17th.
And the streamlined, I have to go to an Open for Business meeting to see about streamlined processes for 100% affordable housing builds.
Okay, Mr. Thorne.
So through the chair, so we just did at the last Open for Business Subcommittee an update on sort of the last year in terms of some of the initiatives and process improvements that were made. Again, these are applying to all applications, not just to affordable housing. If there are specific directions or requests related to some of the approvals process as they apply to affordable housing projects, I would certainly be interested in hearing those. The same Planning Act approval and timeline issues would apply, though. So it would be a question of whether or not our focus has been looking at all aspects of development and all forms of development through Open for Business to this point.
Thank you, Councillor. Thank you. And seeing no other questions, may I please have a motion to receive presentation? Councillor Collins, Councillor Conley, all those in favor? Thank you. Before we adjourn, I think it's important to thank Ida and Kristen for all this work, and Alyssa and Mr. Thorne with your staff. Shonda Wang and John MacKenzie, Joanna Wice, and Edward John. Thank you very much for the workshop. Very informative, and it's something for us to all take back and digest. So may I have now a motion to adjourn? Councillor Pearson, Councillor Vanderbeek, all those in favor? All those in favor? Thank you.